Deep within the Austrian Alps, hidden between towering cliffs and dense evergreen forests, lies a body of water that seems older than time itself. Its surface is perfectly still, dark as glass, and the locals have always said it has no bottom. They call it Lake Toplitz, a glacial lake that would one day become one of the most mysterious sights of the Second World War. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed in on itself, the mountains of Austria became a refuge for retreating German forces, fleeing officials, and men with secrets to bury. Lake Toplitz, tucked away in the Salzkammergut region and surrounded by snow-covered peaks, was one of the last untouched corners of the Reich. And somewhere in those final, desperate days, something was thrown into its depths, something that would capture the world's imagination for generations. At 2,900 feet above sea level, Lake Toplitz stretches less than a mile long and barely 300 meters across. Its beauty is deceptive. Beneath the shimmering alpine surface lies a hidden world of danger, thick layers of decaying logs floating in darkness, and a deadly zone where oxygen disappears completely. At 60 meters deep, the water turns poisonous, a lifeless layer of salt, mud, and hydrogen sulfide where nothing can survive. Divers call it the underwater death trap. When the war ended in May 1945, British and American intelligence units flooded into Austria, hunting for missing Nazi officials, hidden gold, and the archives of a defeated empire. Dozens of rumors pointed toward the lakes of Salzkammergut. Locals whispered of convoys seen at night, trucks covered with tarps, and uniformed men throwing sealed crates into the water. One of those lakes was Toplitz. The first Allied patrols that reached the area found the roads blocked by snow and fallen trees. But villagers spoke freely. They had seen soldiers from the Reichsbank, the German National Treasury, arriving in the final weeks before surrender. Some spoke of Gestapo units guarding the road, others of men in civilian clothes hauling crates marked with swastikas. When the soldiers left, the lake was quiet again, and something heavy was gone. In the years that followed, Lake Toplitz would become more than a dot on a map. It became a name whispered by treasure hunters, intelligence agencies, and historians alike. What lay at the bottom, gold, documents, weapons, or something far stranger, was a question that would never be answered fully. In 1959, more than a decade after the war, a team of Austrian divers made the first serious attempt to explore its depths. The expedition was organized by Hans Fricke, a biologist fascinated by the lake's unique layers. What began as a scientific study quickly became something else. Beneath the floating logs, in that strange twilight of silt and silence, the divers found something man-made. They returned to the surface with a handful of objects, fragments of wooden crates, metal bands, and something even more alarming. Bundles of what looked like currency. British pounds. Dozens of them. Perfectly preserved. Each note was real enough to fool any banker in London, yet every single one was a forgery. The discovery set off a chain reaction that rippled through the intelligence community. For years, whispers had circulated about Operation Bernhard, the Nazi plan to collapse the British economy through mass counterfeiting. But no one had ever found the evidence, until now. The pounds from Lake Toplitz were the first physical proof that the operation hadn't been a myth. The Germans had actually printed millions of pounds worth of fake currency, and when defeat became inevitable, they had dumped the evidence into the lake. Newspapers across Europe exploded with the story. Headlines called Toplitz the Nazi treasure lake, Hitler's hidden vault, the last secret of the Reich. Within months, expeditions began arriving from Germany, Britain, and the United States. Divers, engineers, even journalists wanted a glimpse of what might be hidden below, but the lake didn't give up its secrets easily. In 1963, two professional divers, one Austrian, one German, descended to search for more crates. Neither man returned. Their bodies were later recovered tangled in the submerged log barrier. The lake had claimed its first victims, and its reputation as cursed deepened. By the late 1960s, Lake Toplitz had become a symbol of all that was still hidden from the war, the dark, sunken corner of history that refused to come to light. The Nazi gold train in Poland, the missing amber room of Russia, the lost archives of the SS, all were spoken of in the same breath as Toplitz. But beneath the myth, there was truth. The crates pulled from the lake were real. The forged notes inside were real. and according to the reports filed by British intelligence, they were only part of something much larger. Because deep in those archives, there was one line that investigators could never confirm. Additional sealed containers are believed to remain submerged. No one knew how many, no one knew what was inside them, and those who tried to find out often didn't come back. By early April 1945, the once mighty German Reich was collapsing like a house of cards. Allied forces were closing in from all sides, the Americans from the west, the Soviets from the east. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were now smoldering ruins. Berlin was surrounded, and Adolf Hitler had retreated to his underground bunker, issuing orders that no one obeyed anymore. But while the front lines fell into chaos, far from the ruins of the capital, in the calm and isolation of the Austrian Alps, the Reich still breathed, quietly, methodically, and in secret. The Salzkammergut region, where Lake Toplitz lay hidden, had long been a place of refuge for the German elite. It was close enough to Germany to be accessible, yet remote enough to disappear in. The area's narrow roads, deep forests, and ancient salt mines made it a perfect stronghold for anyone trying to vanish. As the Third Reich unraveled, a steady stream of convoys began moving south, trucks loaded with crates, boxes, and sealed containers. Most bore markings of the Reichsbank, the central bank of Nazi Germany. Others carried insignias of the SS, the Gestapo, or the OKW, the supreme command of the armed forces. Witnesses from nearby villages would later tell Allied investigators about those nights. The convoys came after midnight, their headlights blacked out. Soldiers posted guards along the roads. Some villagers saw men unloading heavy crates onto barges, pushing them toward the lake under torchlight. Then the sound of splashing and silence. When interrogated after the war, some captured officers confirmed that valuables had been sent to Austria in the final weeks. According to a 1946 British report, Reichsbank Vice President Emil Pohl ordered the transfer of financial reserves, currency, and sensitive documentation to secure Alpine locations. Other reports mentioned SS General Ernst Kaltenbrunner, one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy, who was born in the nearby town of Ried and knew the area intimately. Kaltenbrunner was obsessed with secrecy. As the head of the Reich Main Security Office, he controlled the Gestapo, the intelligence services, and all SS field operations. He understood better than anyone what needed to disappear before the Allies arrived. His units were known to have operated in the region around Lake Toplitz and the nearby town of Bad Aussee in April 1945. Bad Aussee was no ordinary mountain village. In the final weeks of the war, it became the nerve center of the Alpine fortress, the mythical last stand of the Nazi regime. It was said that Hitler himself might flee there to rebuild his forces in the mountains. That fortress never existed, but the secrecy surrounding it provided perfect cover for other, more discreet operations. Toplitz, with its deadly waters and isolation, was the ideal hiding place. Unlike larger lakes such as Grundlsee or Hallstätter See, Toplitz was inaccessible, surrounded by sheer cliffs and dense forest. Anything thrown into its depths would vanish completely. By late April, the roads to Toplitz were filled with military traffic. Some convoys came from Berlin, others from Salzburg. The locals kept their distance, but a few watched from the tree line as uniformed men lowered heavy crates into the water. Some of the containers were so large they required winches and ropes. When they hit the surface, they sank without a sound. The operation lasted several nights. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The troops disappeared, leaving behind only tire tracks in the mud and empty fuel drums on the shore. Days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Allied patrols soon reached the Salzkammergut. They found the roads littered with abandoned vehicles and burnt papers, but not the crates. Those were gone, hidden beneath the lake's black surface. Among the Allied officers who first investigated the rumors was Major Ian Colvin, a British intelligence officer with the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Unit, the same organization tasked with recovering stolen art across Europe. Colvin's report from June 1945, now declassified, mentions Lake Toplitz directly. He wrote, "Local sources confirm the disposal of multiple sealed containers in Toplitzsee by SS personnel between 21st and 26th April. No recovery attempts have been made due to the lake's depth and condition." Colvin also noted something curious. Similar reports were coming from nearby lakes, Altussee, Grundlsee, and Traunsee. Altussee would later become famous for hiding over 6,000 stolen artworks, including pieces destined for Hitler's planned museum in Linz. Grundlsee was rumored to contain bank archives and jewels. But Toplitz was different. There were no official records, no lists, no recovered artifacts, only whispers. One Austrian forestry worker interviewed in 1946 described seeing a convoy near Toplitz in the final week of the war. He said the soldiers were not Wehrmacht, they were SS, and they wore black uniforms. When he asked what they were doing, one of them replied, "You didn't see anything." In the following months, as the Allies scoured Austria for gold, art, and documents, Toplitz remained untouched. British engineers considered draining the lake, but the geography made it impossible. Its sides were steep, its depth uncertain, and the water itself too dangerous to work in. The war was over, and the world had other priorities. But not everyone forgot. By the 1950s, with Austria recovering from occupation, stories began to surface again. Stories of divers who vanished, of crates glimpsed in the depths, of strange metallic shapes caught in sonar scans. Each rumor drew more attention, and soon, journalists and treasure hunters began arriving. The legends multiplied. Some said the crates contained gold from the Reichsbank. Others claimed they held missing Nazi archives, secret weapons, or even the bodies of high-ranking officials. One tale spoke of the Black Eagle chest, a mythical strongbox said to contain the personal seal of Adolf Hitler. None of these could be proven, but every time someone looked, they found something, even if it wasn't what they expected. In 1959, when the first real expedition finally reached the bottom, the discovery of forged British banknotes would confirm part of the truth, but also deepen the mystery. Because if the Nazis had gone to such lengths to dump counterfeit money, what else had they hidden there? And why had they guarded it so carefully in the final days of the war? By the late 1950s, more than a decade after the war had ended, the stories surrounding Lake Toplitz had grown far beyond local folklore. Treasure hunters, journalists, and even intelligence agencies had all taken an interest in what might lie beneath its dark surface. The Austrian government had largely ignored the rumors at first, dismissing them as superstition. But after a small group of forestry workers discovered fragments of wooden crates and metal debris near the water's edge, interest reignited. Something was down there. In the summer of 1959, the first organized expedition arrived at Lake Toplitz. It was led by Hans Fricke, a marine biologist and diver who had received special permission from the Austrian authorities to study the lake's unique ecosystem. Fricke's goal had not been treasure. He was fascinated by the strange biology of the lake, where oxygen vanished after 60 meters and no fish could survive. But as soon as he and his divers descended through the layers of murky water, the expedition took a turn none of them expected. The first thing they encountered was the infamous log barrier, a dense mass of floating tree trunks trapped in the lake since the 19th century, when logging companies had used the water to transport timber. These logs, stacked layer upon layer, created a deadly natural wall. Between them, silt and debris had formed narrow tunnels that could trap divers instantly. It was said that the barrier was so thick that even light could barely pass through. Past that barrier, the water turned black. At a depth of around 100 meters, visibility dropped to nothing. The divers relied solely on their lights and their nerves. Beneath them, the lake bed was a thick carpet of mud, fine as powder. Every movement stirred up clouds that lingered for minutes, creating a nightmarish world of darkness and confusion. It was there, around 103 meters down, that one diver's beam caught something unnatural, the sharp edge of metal. Then another, and another. They had found a field of boxes, stacked and scattered, half buried in the silt. When they pried one open, its contents stunned them. Inside were bundles of British 5-pound notes, crisp and perfectly preserved. When they surfaced, Fricke and his team brought up a handful of the notes. The discovery spread like wildfire. British authorities quickly confirmed what many had suspected for years. The notes were part of Operation Bernhard, the Nazi counterfeiting operation designed to flood the British economy with fake currency. The find made international headlines. "Nazi forgery cache found in Austrian lake," read one newspaper. Another called it the ghost treasure of the Third Reich. But even as the story reached the world's front pages, the divers themselves were uneasy. They had found dozens of crates, but no one knew how many more were still down there. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous the dives became. In 1963, a second expedition was organized, this time funded by Stern magazine and the German television channel ZDF. The media wanted a spectacle, live coverage of the search for the lost Nazi gold. But Lake Toplitz had no intention of surrendering its secrets easily. On July 28, 1963, tragedy struck. Two divers, Erwin Resch and Kurt Mitterer, failed to resurface. Their support team waited for hours, scanning the lake for bubbles or signs of life. When rescue divers finally located them the next morning, their bodies were entangled deep within the log barrier, their air supplies exhausted. They had suffocated in total darkness, only meters away from the crates they sought. The tragedy made headlines across Europe. Some called it an accident. Others whispered that the men had found something they weren't meant to see, and that someone, or something, had made sure it stayed hidden. From that point on, the Austrian government banned unsupervised diving in Lake Toplitz. Any new expedition would require official approval and government observers, but that didn't stop the rumors. In fact, it only made them worse. Whispers began to circulate about secret recoveries, about crates that were quietly pulled from the lake by divers working not for treasure hunters or scientists, but for intelligence agencies. According to one Austrian journalist, several sealed boxes had been removed under military escort in 1963, before the media were allowed access. The official story was that they contained war records. Others claimed they held forged currency plates, secret communications, or even personal archives of the SS. But none of this could be proven. Every official inquiry seemed to end with the same words. Nothing of value was found. Yet the divers who had been there told a different story. One recalled seeing not only wooden crates, but also metal cylinders, longer, heavier, and unlike the others. Another spoke of a steel safe half buried in the mud, impossible to move. One diver, who later gave an anonymous interview to a German newspaper, described what he saw. The mud was full of debris. You could see wheels, broken wood, maybe a vehicle frame. It wasn't just money. There were things down there that looked like machinery, like something mechanical. We were told to stop filming. Over the following years, dozens of attempts were made to explore Lake Toplitz again. Most ended quickly. The equipment failed, the visibility vanished, or the divers turned back out of fear. A few claimed to bring up fragments of crates or metal parts, but no verifiable treasure was ever recovered. By the 1970s, the lake had claimed at least 5 lives. The Austrian government closed it entirely to diving except for scientific research. Journalists called it the cursed lake of the Nazis. But among those who studied the post-war intelligence files, one detail stood out. In British and American archives, there were repeated references to unrecovered containers from Operation Bernhard, and a note that suggested not all of them contained currency. The files hinted at sensitive materials, possibly documents, prototypes, or experimental technology, disposed of in the same area. The wording was vague, deliberately so, but it matched the time and location of the Toplitz dumps. By now, Lake Toplitz had transformed from a simple rumor into one of the great enduring mysteries of the 20th century. It was no longer about treasure. It was about what the Nazis had wanted to erase forever, and why. And as later expeditions would reveal, the answer might go far beyond money. Before the divers of the 1950s ever broke the surface of Lake Toplitz, before the British counterfeit notes rose dripping from the mud, the story had begun years earlier in the darkest corridors of the Third Reich. It was 1942, and the war had turned against Germany. The Allies were bombing the heart of the Reich, the Soviet armies were pushing back across the east, and Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year empire was already crumbling. Inside the SS, a new plan took shape, not one of tanks or bombs, but of paper and ink. The architect of this plan was SS Major Bernhard Krüger, a quiet, methodical officer of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS Security Service. Krüger was no ordinary bureaucrat. He was a perfectionist, a man obsessed with technical detail, and he had been given an impossible order by Heinrich Himmler himself. Wreck the British economy. Do it without firing a single shot. Krüger's idea was radical, to forge the very currency of the British Empire, and do it so perfectly that even the Bank of England couldn't tell the difference. If the Reich could flood Britain with millions of fake pounds, confidence in the pound, sterling would collapse, credit would vanish, and the Allied war effort would stumble. It was economic warfare on a scale the world had never seen. The project was codenamed Operation Bernhard, after its leader. The SS built a secret printing facility deep within Sachsenhausen concentration camp just north of Berlin. Behind barbed wire and guard towers in Barrack 19, Krüger assembled a team unlike any other in Nazi Germany. not soldiers, but craftsmen, engravers, printers, chemists, and bankers. Almost all of them were Jewish prisoners. These men, around 140 in total, were experts in their trades before the war. Now their survival depended on their ability to replicate perfection. Every note they produced meant another day of life. Failure meant execution. They began with the 5-pound note, the backbone of Britain's economy. Within months, they had mastered it, every watermark, every fiber, every microscopic detail. Then they moved on to 10 shillings, 20 shillings, and 50 shillings. The Bank of England's anti-counterfeit designs, once thought impossible to copy, fell one by one. By 1943, the Sachsenhausen presses were producing 400,000 notes per month, totaling more than £130 million, the equivalent of billions today. The bills were so flawless that even London banks accepted them as genuine when captured examples appeared in Allied intelligence reports. But Operation Bernhard wasn't just about collapsing economies. The SS used the fake pounds to fund espionage across Europe. Agents were paid in counterfeit cash, operations financed through fake British currency that moved freely in the black markets of Lisbon, Istanbul, and Zurich. As the war dragged on, however, the Reich faced a new problem: storage. The counterfeit notes were piling up in crates faster than they could be distributed. When Allied bombers struck Berlin in 1944, Kruger and his team were forced to evacuate. The entire operation was packed into trucks and moved south to Austria, to a place that would soon become infamous. The convoy arrived at Redl-Zipf, an underground complex in the mountains near Ebensee, where the SS had been developing experimental jet engines. From there, Kruger resumed production, this time focusing on American dollars, hoping to undermine the United States as well. But before the first batch could be completed, the Allies were closing in. By April 1945, chaos ruled what remained of the Reich. Kruger received orders to destroy all evidence of Operation Bernhard, every plate, press, and note. The crates of counterfeit money, numbering in the hundreds, were loaded onto trucks and driven deeper into the Austrian Alps under SS guard. Their destination: the remote Salzkammergut region near Lake Toplitz. It was here, according to captured SS officers, that the final act of Operation Bernhard took place. The printing plates, currency, and documents were sealed in wooden boxes and thrown into the lake under cover of night. Some were dumped directly from the shore. Others were ferried to the deepest point by boat and pushed overboard. What remained of Kruger's team was captured soon after the German surrender. During Allied interrogation, Kruger calmly explained what had been done. "It was all destroyed in the Austrian lakes," he said. "Toplitz, Grundlsee, and elsewhere. None of it remains." But even the Allies didn't believe him completely. In the following months, British intelligence found fragments of the printing presses hidden in salt mines and caches of counterfeit pounds scattered across Europe. When divers found the first bundles of those notes in Toplitz Lake 14 years later, they proved that Kruger's confession was only half true. Yet, for all the discovery revealed, it also deepened the mystery. Because according to post-war testimony, the SS hadn't only used the Toplitz operation to hide counterfeit currency, it had also been used as a cover. Several witnesses described seeing sealed metal cylinders loaded alongside the money crates, containers marked not with bank insignia but with military codes. Some claimed they contained documents, prototypes, or research materials from secret SS projects. Others believed they held the personal archives of the RSHA, the Nazi Intelligence Directorate. Whatever those containers held, none of them were ever officially recovered. And if they still lay beneath the mud and salt water of Lake Toplitz, they might hold the final untouched records of a regime that tried to erase its own crimes before it died. Operation Bernhard was the largest counterfeiting project in history, and the only one that ended, not in a vault, but at the bottom of a lake. By the early 1960s, Lake Toplitz was no longer just an Austrian curiosity. It had become an international obsession. The Cold War was now in full swing, and anything that bore the shadow of the Third Reich drew the attention of both East and West. In the New World Order, information was as valuable as gold, and the thought that Nazi archives, technologies, or coded intelligence might still rest untouched in an Austrian lake was enough to send ripples through every intelligence service in Europe. The first official post-war expeditions had been chaotic, but by the late 1960s, the interest had shifted from treasure hunters to governments. Behind closed doors, both the CIA and MI6 began quietly funding scientific operations in Austria under the pretext of oceanographic or hydrological research. Declassified reports later revealed that several of these missions had taken place in the Salzkammergut region between 1965 and 1971, and almost all had made stops at Lake Toplitz. Officially, they were studying the unique anoxic layers of the lake, water so deprived of oxygen that it preserved anything that sank into it. In reality, they were searching for records, prototypes, and evidence of late-war SS operations. The Cold War powers wanted to know what else had been hidden by the Third Reich, especially the kinds of secret projects that could have military or technological value. Rumors began to circulate in Austrian newspapers that American divers had recovered several sealed cylinders from the lake during one of these missions. The government denied it, claiming no foreign agencies had permission to operate there. But locals told a different story. Fishermen in the nearby village of Gössel spoke of military trucks arriving at night, of barges being towed across the lake without lights, and of helicopters that hovered over the water in complete silence. The Austrian Ministry of the Interior, faced with growing public fascination, declared the entire area restricted in 1969, citing environmental concerns. But the restriction only deepened the mystery. No one could verify what, if anything, had been recovered. In the early 1970s, a new player entered the story, the German magazine Stern, which had already covered the 1959 discoveries. Determined to expose what they believed was a deliberate cover-up, the publication funded another private expedition led by the experienced diver Günther Wendt. Wendt and his team used sonar mapping technology, a first for the lake. The scans revealed several large, solid shapes lying deep below the log barrier, rectangular masses consistent with containers, vehicles, or machinery. One sonar image in particular stood out. It showed a massive, elongated object, roughly 8 meters long, buried under layers of mud near the lake's center. Some experts believed it was a large safe or crate. Others speculated it could be a mini-submarine or a cargo pod used by the SS to transport heavy loads. When Wendt's team attempted to reach the object, they encountered what divers before them had: total darkness, cold that cut through their suits, and the constant risk of entanglement. Twice, communication cables snapped. Once, a diver's light went out mid-descent, and he barely made it back alive. The conditions were so deadly that even Wendt called off the attempt after 3 days. What they brought up instead was smaller but no less intriguing: fragments of wooden planks, bits of corroded metal, and a single rusted container lid stamped with the Reichsadler, the imperial eagle of Nazi Germany. The find was quietly confiscated by Austrian police, who refused to say where it had been taken. After that, Stern abandoned its search. But whispers persisted that during those dives, something larger had been discovered and removed before journalists ever saw it. By the 1980s, Lake Toplitz had become something of a legend within intelligence circles. In Vienna, retired officers spoke of it as a dead drop, a site used by Nazi officials to dispose of not just money, but evidence. According to one former British intelligence analyst interviewed decades later, certain post-war investigations into Nazi gold had been quietly redirected away from Toplitz. The Americans didn't want to find gold, he said. They wanted to find information. And once they did, they made sure nobody else went looking. This theory gained credibility when a declassified CIA memorandum from 1968 surfaced, referencing an Austrian freshwater containment site with potential counterintelligence materials of historical interest. The name Toplitz didn't appear, but the coordinates listed in the file matched the lake precisely. At the same time, a number of strange incidents kept the myth alive. In 1972, a local diver exploring illegally vanished without a trace. His boat was found adrift the next morning, gear still on board, but no sign of him. Search teams scoured the lake for a week before declaring him drowned, yet no body was ever recovered. 2 years later, hikers discovered fragments of printed documents near a mountain stream connected to the Toplitz outflow. Though heavily decayed, they contained German military letterheads dated 1944 and partial references to Sonderaktion Alpen, Special Operation Alps. When Austrian archivists tried to trace the documents, they found nothing in the official war records by that name. By the late 20th century, Lake Toplitz had taken on an almost mythical aura. Scientists came to study its unique ecosystem. Journalists came chasing Nazi gold. But under the surface, the same mystery remained unsolved. Every expedition returned with the same haunting descriptions: a lakebed covered in logs, darkness so complete that even the most powerful lights seemed to die within meters, and strange metallic echoes that sonar could detect but no diver could reach. One Austrian diver who explored the lake in 1984 put it best: "You feel like the water itself doesn't want you there." Every sound echoes differently, every movement stirs the past, and sometimes you swear you can hear chains clinking beneath the surface. Over time, scientists proved that the lake's composition made recovery almost impossible. The water below 60 meters contained no oxygen and no life. Anything that sank into it would remain preserved indefinitely, sealed away in black water and mud. It meant that whatever the SS had dumped there in 1945, whether gold, documents, or something far stranger, was still there, untouched, waiting. And though modern equipment could now map the entire lake with precision, the Austrian government continued to limit access. Every new generation of divers and researchers hit the same invisible wall of bureaucracy. Officially, Lake Toplitz was protected for environmental reasons. Unofficially, it remained one of the few places in Europe where World War II had never truly ended. By the turn of the 21st century, Lake Toplitz had drifted from wartime rumor into legend. For decades, it had remained sealed off, its surface calm, its depths undisturbed. But technology was catching up to myth. In the early 2000s, a new generation of researchers arrived, not soldiers or treasure hunters this time, but scientists armed with robotic submersibles, sonar arrays, and high-definition cameras capable of operating where human divers could not. The most ambitious of these efforts came in 2000, when a team from the University of Hamburg partnered with Austrian authorities for a full survey of the lake. They used side-scan sonar to chart the basin in 3 dimensions, revealing shapes no human eye had ever seen. Among the natural ridges and sediment layers were several rectangular anomalies, perfectly geometric and clustered along the deepest trench, shapes that did not belong to geology. When the submersible cameras descended to investigate, the feed turned almost immediately to darkness. The water below 60 meters absorbed light like ink. What little the cameras captured showed the same haunting scene described by divers half a century earlier: fallen trees, twisted cables, and occasional flashes of metal protruding from the mud. One sequence appeared to show a corroded metal box, edges sharp despite decades underwater. Before the robot could approach, its thrusters stirred the silt into an impenetrable brown fog. By the time visibility returned, the object was gone, swallowed again by the lake. The expedition recovered fragments of wood and rusted iron, but no treasure, no documents, no proof. Yet the sonar maps released months later reignited fascination worldwide. Documentary crews from Britain, Germany, and the United States descended on Gosel that summer, turning the quiet lakeside village into a temporary carnival of speculation. Then, in 2002, a British production company working with National Geographic returned with advanced remotely operated vehicles. Their footage, broadcast under the title Secrets of the Nazi Lake, showed something new: stamped aluminum sheets bearing traces of serial numbers, and what looked like part of a mechanical apparatus, possibly from aircraft equipment. Austrian engineers who examined still frames later confirmed the pieces were consistent with World War II-era Luftwaffe components. The discovery deepened the mystery. If Operation Bernhard had been about counterfeiting currency, why were there aircraft parts in the same dump site? Some historians began to suspect that Toplitz had served multiple purposes, perhaps as a disposal site for other SS programs operating in the region's mountain factories. Throughout the 2000s, more expeditions followed. Each one added fragments, but never the whole picture. In 2005, a team led by Dr. Hans Fricke, the same diver who had first located the counterfeit notes in 1959, returned with mini-submersibles and high-intensity lighting. At 105 meters, one of the subs located several steel cylinders partially buried in the silt, 2 meters long, capped at both ends, and arranged side by side as if deliberately placed. Before the team could recover them, a hydraulic line burst. The sub lost buoyancy control and had to abort. The mission was called off, officially for safety reasons. Privately, one crew member later admitted that the cylinders had been marked with faded white stencils, letters beginning with SSR. The rest of the inscription had been obscured. The following year, the Austrian government once again restricted diving in the area, citing environmental preservation. The official report claimed the disturbance of silt risked contaminating the lake's unique ecosystem. But to those who had followed the story for decades, it looked like déjà vu, another wall of secrecy. By 2010, Lake Toplitz had become the subject of university theses, conspiracy documentaries, and online forums where theories ranged from the credible to the fantastical. Some claimed the lake held uranium samples or rocket research from the V weapons program. Others spoke of SS gold, hidden art, even proof of post-war escape routes. One particularly persistent theory suggested that sealed within the deeper mud layers were archives of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization dedicated to pseudoscientific and occult research. The theory had little evidence, but it captivated the public imagination. Every decade seemed to reinvent the legend, shaping Toplitz into a mirror for the fears and obsessions of its time. In 2018, the Austrian Federal Forest Authority authorized a limited new study using autonomous underwater drones equipped with multi-beam sonar. The results, partially published in 2020, confirmed that at least dozens of man-made objects still rested on the lakebed, some metallic, some wooden, some of unknown material. The researchers concluded that significant anthropogenic debris remained unrecovered, but the final report ended with an almost poetic line. Given the depth, composition, and isolation of the site, complete recovery may never be possible. Lake Toplitz will likely preserve its contents indefinitely. And so, more than 75 years after the last SS trucks vanished into the Austrian forest, the truth still lay sealed in darkness, preserved by cold, pressure, and silence. Today, hikers pass the lake without realizing what lies beneath. The surface reflects pine trees and mountain peaks, serene and innocent. But below, time has stopped. The counterfeit notes, the rusted crates, the mysterious cylinders, all remain as they were the night the Third Reich died. Lake Toplitz has become more than a place. It is a time capsule of fear and secrecy, an underwater archive of humanity's most dangerous century. And until someone finds a way to pierce the mud and lift its final secret into the light, the lake will keep its vigil, a mirror of still water guarding the ghosts of a vanished empire. By the time the 21st century reached its third decade, Lake Toplitz had outlived everyone who had ever touched its story. The SS guards who threw their cargo into its depths were long dead. The counterfeiters of Operation Bernard had passed quietly into history. Even the divers who first broke the surface in 1959 were gone. Yet the lake remained still and indifferent, as if it existed outside time itself. Scientists had explained its mysteries, the lack of oxygen below 60 meters, the density of salt water preserved from ancient seas, the geological layers that made recovery nearly impossible. But no scientific language could explain why the story refused to die. Toplitz had become something larger than a wartime relic. It had become a symbol of secrecy, of power buried and never accounted for. For decades, governments had promised transparency. Austria, Germany, even Britain had declassified thousands of wartime files. But the most critical records, the ones that might finally name what was hidden beneath that lake, remained sealed, redacted, or lost. Each new release ended the same way. No gold, no documents, no confirmation. Only silence. And yet fragments continued to surface. In 2021, hikers discovered a rusted military crate along a stream feeding into the lake. Inside were degraded tools, 2 corroded badges, and a sheet of aluminum stamped with the eagle of the Reich. The find made headlines for a week before vanishing from public record. Locals said officials arrived quietly that night and took everything away. Some divers still tried, slipping into the black water without permits, chasing echoes of history. Most returned with nothing but stories, flashes of metal in their lights, shapes that disappeared when they drew near, and the unsettling sense that they were being watched from below. Others didn't return at all. Over time, the story of Lake Toplitz stopped being about what might be down there, and started being about why it was hidden at all. Historians argued that the lake symbolized the final act of Nazi Germany, not defiance, but erasure. In its last months, the Reich had tried to bury every trace of what it had done. Evidence, records, technology, even the bodies of those who knew too much. The lake became their perfect grave. Cold, silent, unreachable. But others saw something different. They saw a warning, a reminder that even the most powerful empires end the same way, not with victory, but with fear of their own truth. Today, visitors stand on the narrow wooden pier at Gössel and see nothing but reflection. The water is black, opaque, still as glass. They hear the wind through the trees and the distant sound of falling rock, and for a moment, they imagine what lies below. The counterfeit notes, the sealed cylinders, the wreckage of an empire that drowned itself to keep its secrets. No one knows if Lake Toplitz still holds gold or documents or nothing at all, but the power of its story lies not in what's found, but in what's never proven. For nearly 80 years, it has remained one of the last unbroken vaults of the Second World War, a place where rumor, history, and silence converge. And perhaps that is why, after all this time, we still look into its depths, not to recover treasure, but to see if the past will finally look back.